Oh,
Yes? Excellent. So you've been in the storehouse, the one that had all the furs inside? Do you know that that's the only original building of the fort? That building is so old, it's 27 years older than Canada. And it's the oldest standing building of Fort Langley, and it's the oldest building that was not built by First Nations on this side of the Rocky Mountains and north of California. But there's something really special about that building, and that's because of how it's built. And the way it's built, I'm going to use examples of how the Hudson's Bay Company had to build their buildings by the time they came to the West Coast. Because at the beginning, when the company started to build most of their buildings for its first 100 years of existence, most of the 1700s, they had to use stone. So I'm using Play-Doh as an example for stones. And they would have to we'll use this cushion as the land that you're building on, and then you would build stone after stone after stone, and then you'd have to get something called a mortar, like a glue, to try to stick it together. And this is how you would build the walls for your buildings until you could have all four walls for your house. Pretty sturdy house once it's all done. Next problem though, it's hard to move. So what if you made a mistake and realized all our customers aren't really here? We need to move them somewhere else. We need to move our fort closer to our customers. You can't move your house that you just built. You're going to have to go build a whole new house. Second problem, all of our traveling is by boat, so we're close to rivers. And if the river happens to flood, most of the land you're on is on soft soil, which means the ground you're on soaks up the water of the river when it floods. So your building, because it's so heavy, starts to sink. That's not good. So the Hudson's Bay Company, as they were moving to the west, realized these stones, they're nice, they can last a long time, but they're not the best way for us to build our buildings. We're going to use wood. We can find wood wherever our forts are. So instead, we are going to build our homes like Lego. And we're going to build the homes like a boat. Kind of confused yet? Good, because I was too when I started working at Fort Langley. First, you're going to build the bottom base of your house. It's called the sill beam. And then you're going to cut out pieces of wood and attach them to the sill beam. And then you're going to put pieces of wood on top of that. So I could do it like this, and I can move the pieces of wood in case I make a mistake. And I can keep building on top of the beam. Next problem, remember, if the ground gets wet and starts to get really soft, this is softer than the stone. It stays on top. And if the ground moves, my house moves like a ship. Stays in one piece at all times, so it doesn't break apart. But the best reason for this, if we had to move, we could. Because Fort Langley, when it was first built, isn't where it is today. It was actually built 4 kilometers away. It's a park today. It's called Derby Reach. And what they realized was they built the fort too close to the river. And 12 years after Fort Langley was built, the bosses of the fort said, you know what, we have to move a little bit further away from the river so the flood water doesn't flood the fort. So everyone, we have to take apart our buildings. And that's exactly what they did. They took apart the buildings, kind of like a Lego set, And then they had oxen, giant bulls, pulling these logs up against the current of the river, all the way up to where Fort Langley is today. And then they put the buildings back together, kind of like an old-fashioned Lego set. But truthfully, all the logs, they weren't cut out like Lego pieces. That would be a little too difficult. They were put together in what we call post on sill, tongue and groove, kind of like Lincoln logs. Have some of you heard of Lincoln logs before? So that's where you have a big post, and inside the post you have a groove cut into it, and the sideway beams have little tongues and they fit into the grooves. And that's exactly how you would have the house built. So I just have 4 slides here to show of how it was put together. And I'll show that to you. Here we go. So here is some of the buildings that they'd have out of stone. This is the style that they'd have at the very beginning. So real sturdy, could last forever. This building here, this style, could last hundreds of years. Because it's made out of stone, it's real strong. It's not going to get damaged that easily, but again, the problem is it's really heavy, so if the river was to flood, this building could sink, and it's difficult to move. And that's a problem with the Hudson's Bay Company. So you put your house together kind of like that. You just slide them in and out. And if you've been to Fort Langley before, you've probably seen our playhouse. That's a building you see right in the front of that picture. Some of you have been able to take apart those walls and move them. That's the main reason we built that playhouse in the fort. So you would all have the understanding of why those buildings were put together that way. Because it was easy to take apart. Now that playhouse, it's a lot easier than the real buildings. Each beam in the real building weighs closer to about 1,000 to 2,000 pounds. And that's why you would need oxen and big pulley systems to move those ones. And the storehouse, that building right there, is the only original building still standing of Fort Langley. So when Canada was born, that building was already 27 years old. And the next advantage of this, like I said earlier last week, it would take 6 months to come from England. And that includes if you want something made out of metal. But because we're building in this style, we don't need nails to put those walls up. You don't need nails for Lego. So there's no nails keeping the walls or ceiling up in that building. The only nails they use inside that house were the nails to keep the floorboards down. And the only other metal in that house are the hinges and handles for the doors and windows. Everything else we could take apart and move just like an old-fashioned Lego set. And if you look really closely, you can actually see how it's kind of put together. And at the very bottom, that big log at the bottom, it all rests on, that's the sill beam. So if you can still see my image where I'm holding the Legos, it's this big green piece at the bottom, is that sill beam that it's resting on. The whole house just rests on that. So if the ground was to get soft and move, this whole house doesn't break apart. It actually leans like a ship. And one of the coolest things in Fort Langley is after we've had heavy rains, and if the Fraser River has threatened to flood a little bit, the ground still does get soft in Fort Langley, that our building itself will still lean. And sometimes we can even put a marble in the middle of our room, and we can actually watch the marble roll to a different corner of the building. And if that's what's happened, we could actually move some of the furniture to the other side of the building and let the weight of the furniture balance the building back. And that was the advantage, because these buildings were meant to last and take quite the punishment of moving. But surprisingly, though, they weren't really meant to last more than about 50 years. It's really an accident that our storehouse has lasted as long as it has. Because by the time it was supposed to be torn down, Fort Langley closed their operations. And the farmer that bought the land, his name was Alexander Mavis, he took a look at the building and said the Hudson's Bay Company did a really good job of the storehouse. So you know what he decided to turn it into? A stable for his sheep. So for about 14 years, his sheep lived in that house. And then in the year 1900, Alexander Mavis hired farmhands, people to work on his farm for him. And they kicked the sheep out of that house and they moved in. And when they moved in, they said, you know what? We need to brighten the place up. So they used a paint called whitewash. And they're the ones that actually painted the house white in 1900. And in whitewash, there's this chemical called lye. And that is actually a bug deterrent and it preserves the wood. And that accidentally saved the building. And by 1923, the government of Canada saw that this building was still standing all the way from 1840. So in 1923, the government of Canada said, hang on, we need to keep this building. It's an important part of Canada's story. So in 1923, the storehouse in Fort Langley became a National Historic Site. And it took 35 more years to slowly build it back to make it look like the historic site we see today. And it opened in 1958 as a historic site. But that's the storehouse that we see. And that's how it's built together. It's the oldest standing building in BC. Any questions?
So, so you say that that building is the oldest standing building in BC. The other buildings in the fort, they're all recreated to be like what it was like, right?
Yeah, they're put together to look like it would have back in the 1850s. But nowadays, there are building regulations, so we have to follow codes to make sure the buildings are built as safe as possible. So some of the buildings are made to look like they would have back in the 1800s, but we have to hide the metal well.
That makes sense because you don't really want the buildings falling on people, right?
Exactly. Two of the buildings, though, like the big house and the servants' quarters, those were rebuilt in 1958 when the fort first opened, and those were still built in the same old-fashioned style. So all the logs were cut by hand and put together, but then they had to take a lot of safety precautions. So there still are some metal beams here and there to make sure it stays put.
So boys and girls who are listening, have you guys been to the fort in the play area? There's a kids area where there's a kids trading post and stuff. Have you guys been to that area before and tried to build a fort using the foam blocks there? So that's kind of a similar style of how it was built, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. So Lacey has a question.
How long would it take for them to build one house like that?
That's an excellent question. The best way that we found how long it took was pretty much by an accident made by the blacksmith in 1840. He accidentally burned the whole place down. So they had to rebuild the fort. And so everyone had to get back together and slowly start to rebuild the buildings. Within 2.5 weeks, a new wall was up. And it wasn't the whole wall like we see it today. It was probably only about half the size of the fort. And over the years, they slowly kept expanding it. But averaging it out, we were able to figure out that it would probably take 6 men and 2 oxen and maybe half a dozen sons, so 6 sons, about 6 weeks to put a building together from scratch. So that means going out, chopping down the wood, cutting the branches out, squaring off the logs, and then cutting them into space, and then as well as the tongues and the grooves, and positioning it and putting it all back together. 6 weeks, which is very, very fast if you really think about it for a building the size of the storehouse. But that doesn't include painting it. That doesn't include adding something like windows. That would come later on. Because if you wanted windows as well, you'd have to order them from England.
So in how many people lived within the walls of the fort? Like at its biggest booming time, how many people would live within the fort?
That's a good question. And that's something that always changes every year because overall, at its most, Fort Langley would have had 25 families. So mom, dad, and then kids for each family at its most would have been about 120 people. But the thing is, not everyone lived inside the fort. You lived where you worked. So if you were the farmers, you lived closer or even on that giant farm. If your dad was the boat builder, you're probably living closer to the river. If your dad had his job inside the fort, you lived inside the fort. But if it was outside the fort, you lived outside. Um, the only reason there was a wall, number one, keep the wild animals out because there's all this good smelling food inside. Remember, we had thousands and thousands of pounds of dried salmon, pickled salmon, even, and, you know, skinned animals. So you're attracting a lot of wild animals. We are in black bear country. So that's one of the main reasons the fort had a wall. But there was never a threat of an attack. All we were was a shopping center. Everyone outside was family. All the moms were First Nations. So some people might even be living with their mom's side of the family, be it with the Kwantlen tribes or any of the Stalo tribes up and down the Fraser River.
So I had another question while you're talking and now I can't remember it. So if they had houses on the farm or by the river or wherever they were working, would those have been built in the same basic style as the storehouse as well?
More often than not, that would be the best bet. Yeah, you would try to build it in the same style because everyone knew how to build it in that style. Everyone would be taught that. No matter what your job, when you signed a contract to work with the Hudson's Bay Company, you had to be skilled with an axe.
Perfect.
It doesn't matter if you're the boss, it doesn't matter if you're the blacksmith, doesn't matter if you're the farmer. You have to know how an axe works and you better be able to use it. Same thing with a sewing needle. Because no one's going to fix your clothes if they get torn except yourself.
It'd be interesting today to see how many families you could put in a situation like that and be like, build a house.
Exactly.
And see if they have the skills to do that. I'm sure there's reality TV shows and stuff like that.
It would be fun to watch. And that's one of our favorite things when my family goes camping is to see how we start fires because we still just use flint and steel.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, we went as a family for a walk down by Derby Reach. And because all the campgrounds are closed, the kids were pretending to build a fire in the fire pits. And my daughter remembered being at the blacksmith and how they use the flint and steel to start, but she was convinced that she could use any two materials to hit together. So after about a half an hour of trying, she realized that there's actually specialized materials for starting a fire like that. But
yeah, so hopefully once I'm back at the fort, one of the classes might be showing how flint and steel works. So we'll see how that works.
There's so much cool stuff once you get back into the fort. So Lacey and Declan and Grayson and Cole and other people watching, the fort is actually going to be opening up in a couple of weeks. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that looks like for the first phase of reopening?
Yeah, June 8th, Fort Langley will be reopening to the public. The buildings will stay closed because we are in the process of redesigning it, making it safer for the public to go inside the buildings. But we're going to open up the walls of the fort so people can come walk right on inside the fort. The parking lot, the orchard, the picnic areas, those will all be open June 8th.
So thank you very much for joining us today, Amin, and Grayson and Cole and Lacey and Declan and anyone else who was watching the video as well later. We hope that you join us next week at 9:30 on Wednesday.